So, after a good long year and a half or so, I am finally finished with reviewing every single Kingdom Hearts title that aren't the phone games. And while I loved going on that journey and had an absolute blast going through each game that mattered a lot to me since childhood, I realized that with that marathon finished, I needed a new series to review. And this started my long expedition to figure out what I was going to do next. Originally, the plan was to do the Golden Sun trilogy. I had even beaten the first game and started a draft for it, although its sequel ended up taking a lot longer than expected. Then I had the idea to do the Wild Arms franchise, but I also really didn't have a huge amount of means to play that outside of emulation, so, fuck me, I guess. That'll happen one of these days, don't worry. But I wanted to do something a little more portable at the same time so I could take my Switch to work. So I kept thinking, and then it hit me. Why not do the Mana series now? A franchise that I actually have very little involvement in outside of the recently released Visions title, and watching the videos that my friend Kaiser made, of course. Hell, this decision was made even easier because I had a copy of Collection of Mana for my birthday. And with all of those factors lining up, I decided to begin the series. And to kick off this review fest, we will be talking about the first game in the franchise known as Final Fantasy Adventure. Yeah, fun little fact about this franchise, the first game was a Final Fantasy title. It didn't gain the Mana title until we got to the Super Nintendo days with Secrets of Mana. To make this even more interesting, the first game in the series was on a Game Boy, something I haven't really had a lot of experience with as my first handheld was a Game Boy Advance, and I never really played a whole lot of Game Boy titles. I did play some color ones with the Pokemon games, but I was pretty blank on the whole library before that, so admittedly, I was interested to try out this game and see what I thought of it. So that begs the question, what did I think of it? Well, how about we get into this video and find out. To kick off this review nice and steady like, let's get into the first thing you see in the game. The graphics. It is very of the times. Now, like I said earlier, I grew up a Game Boy Advance kid. The closest I had had to any of the Game Boy games were my experience with Pokemon titles. So, while I could be some annoying doofus who tries to compare the games of that era to this one, I'm going to meet it on its own terms and examine it as fairly as possible. And what do I think? Actually, I think it looks nice. Yeah, it was a little jarring to see maybe 2 or 3 different colors, all of which being black, white, and gray take up all of the screen. I think the game's real claim to fame here lies in its sprite work. I don't know what kind of black magic the Square Wizards were using on this title, considering how much is in the game. Enemies move around on the screen in their own little patterns. Several of the characters and boss monsters have unique little sprite designs. There are several different attack animations. Considering the hardware they were working with, this is a massive fucking accomplishment. I'm genuinely surprised more people don't talk about this, because the sprite work on this game is legitimately impressive. Like, any reservations I had about this title on how it looks, or not having any sort of color to it whatsoever, just immediately were blown away by my praise for the sprite work. And while the game itself was definitely visually impressive, I personally say that combat was the most amazing part of this game, so let me gush about that for a bit. Now, Final Fantasy Adventure is an action RPG, so considering this is a Game Boy title, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what's the most you could do with this? Is it just going to be sword combat only? You have no idea. So instead of just being a simple action RPG with one weapon, Final Fantasy Adventure not only comes with multiple different weapons you can use, but several different magic spells that you can cast in battle to destroy enemies or heal yourself. Yeah, so when I mentioned that this game ended up surpassing my expectations while I played, this was one of the main things I was talking about. I was not expecting a Game Boy title of all things to have such a variety of different combat options. For weapons, there are about 6 or so different choices. Swords, sickles, a Morningstar mace, axes, spears, and my personal favorite, the chains. Yeah, whip that monster good. Final Fantasy Adventure is my favorite Castlevania title. But I think the coolest part about it is how not only every move comes with its own unique attack animation, and even some used to traverse the overworld, like the chain grabbing the log so you can get over lakes, but each comes with their own special stamina move. Oh shit, I should probably explain what the stamina is, huh? So, underneath your health and magic, there's a bar that continuously fills up, known as your stamina meter. It starts filling up immensely slowly at the beginning of the game, and increases in speed the further in you get through leveling up, which is also how you increase your attack and magic. But when the stamina is maxed out, it allows you to utilize special super moves tied to a weapon. Each one comes with its own different effect. The sword can basically be this giant area attack in a straight line, the axe throws a projectile, the chain extends about twice its length, and the spear shoots out a spear that does multiple hits at once. And the best part is each weapon controls very well, at least for Game Boy standards. So for the most part, gameplay feels very nice. And that goes double for the overworld too. I mentioned it a little before with the chain that lets you traverse certain parts you couldn't get over by foot, but you can also do things like using the axe to cut down trees to find new paths, or you can use the sickle to cut down grass to get to switches. But my personal favorite is the Morning Star, as once you get it, you can use it to knock down walls so you no longer have to buy pickaxes. Not only does it allow you to no longer have to continuously run back to stores to buy new pickaxes whenever you run out, but it also helps you save on inventory space, as the game does not have a lot of inventory. And once you finally slaughter enough enemies, you get a level up. Then you can choose whether to boost your stamina, power, wisdom, or willpower. My main picks were usually either power or wisdom, which is great as this gives you not only different ways to build your character, but it even offers a bit of replay value as you could focus purely on strength for one playthrough, and then your second can be all about magic or stamina. I've always been a fan of games that let you basically build your own character, so I was happy to see Adventure include that. That's cool. Although, that's all I have to say about gameplay. So how about we get to chatting about the characters and the story next? They're fine for what they are. This is a Game Boy era RPG, and back in the day they weren't really known for their super in-depth storytelling, as video games weren't really meant to tell you much of a story. It was very simple, by the numbers, beat the bad guy and save the world plot. Nothing bad, but nothing great either. There are one or two moments where I felt like it was kind of underwhelming, but for the most part the narrative is fine. But I'll tell you what's really good though is the soundtrack. As someone who is a proud enjoyer of the Visions of Mana soundtrack, I was curious about what the series' origins would be like in terms of music, especially since the composer was completely different from the one in the newest game. Final Fantasy Adventure's soundtrack was done by Kenji Ito, an RPG OG whose works were found in the earlier era of Final Fantasy. He's also pretty prolific in the Saga games as well, and man, I was very impressed by his work here. Boss and overworld themes were consistently fun to listen to throughout my run of the game. No complaints from me whatsoever. Hearing him here has got me really excited to see how the Secrets and later on Trials of Mana soundtracks compare. Should be fun to experience. But that's all I've got to say in terms of my pros. So how about we get into the cons now? So when it comes to the negatives of Final Fantasy Adventure, what exactly do I have to say about it? Honestly, not a whole lot, because a lot of this game's problems can kind of just be summed up to a fact that it was a product of its time. Reviewing this is sort of like reviewing the original Final Fantasy, where its flaws are definitely there, but a good portion of them can be somewhat excused due to the limitations of the hardware. An example of this being how, due to a lack of buttons on the Game Boy, you have to constantly pause the game to swap out equipment on your A and B buttons. Or the fact that since everything is a square by square room, you gotta get used to seeing a lot of scene transitions. It's annoying, sure, but it's also something you've got to expect going into games of that era, so I don't want to majorly hold that against it. Same with its graphics. The pixel art is fantastic for the time, but I can understand some people tuning out the game when they don't have any of the colors to look at other than gray, black, and white. That said, while I am trying to give this game a fair shot and look past the limitations of the time, there are some things that it tries to do that I don't think work very well. For one, its story. So I can overlook the story not really being all that impactful due to the fact that it wasn't really a thing you really did in games back then. They were more for entertainment than trying to give this deep emotional narrative. The only issue is when it really tries to have some moments that try to add a bit more emotional depth, but it doesn't really work well in the slightest. Like when one of your friends becomes a Medusa and you need to kill her to get the tears to save her brother, they try to have the moments where it's supposed to be painful and hurtful seeing her die, but I knew this chick for 20 minutes, so I didn't really care. And while I do try to excuse some gameplay aspects, part of this game was pretty frustrating. The fact that you have to buy keys before you enter a dungeon is just straight up tedious. Made even worse that in some areas doors will re-lock themselves, so if you accidentally use up all your keys, you have to leave the dungeon and go get another set, which can just make the game longer than necessary. Just have keys appear in dungeons. It's not really that hard to do. You can just make enemies drop them in there. They had to have been easier for the player than just forcing them to leave a dungeon to go get more keys, right? I don't know, it's just a weird gameplay decision that I don't think really works. It just got more irritating the longer the game went on. Adding on to that was how certain enemies were handled and how long puzzles would take if you accidentally killed them. So Final Fantasy Adventure has these dungeons where you need to freeze an enemy with ice magic and put them on top of a switch to open the door. I actually like this mechanic. That adds a lot more to dungeons than just opening doors with keys and pickaxes. Unfortunately, it's a system that comes with a couple problems. First off, it can be super finicky on where it wants the placement of the enemy you froze. So if you mess up, you may have to restart the entire room, And if that wasn't bad enough, the game's second issue, where enemies will just not load back into the room unless you leave for like 5 more minutes, which can make puzzles unnecessarily longer, and ends up making them the weakest part of the game as a result. Okay, so is there anything else? Oh yeah, make sure you have a map with you, because this will be insanely confusing to navigate your way around the overworld without one. It's one of those games without a guide or a map, you're going to be stuck for a while, so they're great to have by your side. Outside of that, no more cons, so let's get to the final thoughts. Welp, we're finally at the end of the review, and I've got to admit, I walked away from this game a lot more satisfied than I was expecting to be. Despite dealing with some jank that was expected of the time, I have to admit, Final Fantasy Adventure was way better than I expected it to be. It was overall a great start to this marathon. That's why my final rating for this game is a pretty positive overall, 7.5 out of 10. And with that said, that's all for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw here, give me a favor and like and sub down below. We're on the road to 1K, and I think we can get there before July comes around. Hit the bell for some notifications for when my videos go up. And what did you think of this title? Let me know in the comments down below. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you next time for more RPG content.